When you ask people to reflect on their own inner experience, what's going on in their head as they're walking to work or lying in the bath or chopping vegetables in the kitchen, people tend to report there's an awful lot of language. People tend to say that they talk to themselves a lot silently in their head as they're going about their business. So as a psychologist, I'm interested in where these internal voices come from, what they're doing there, what are their functions, and what is it like to have these experiences. And in the more recent part of my career, I've been interested in a more unusual phenomenon, that of hearing voices, or to use its medical term, auditory verbal hallucinations. So I and my colleagues at Durham figured that what we should try to do is look at the experience from lots of different perspectives, lots of different academic disciplines. So we don't just have the psychologists and the neuroscientists, we have theologians, we have philosophers, we have medieval historians and literary scholars, and so on. And we're trying to understand this experience from as broad a range of perspectives as possible. And that becomes really interesting. So one of the things that struck me quite early on in this research was the need to take a richer, broader view of it than would typically be the case in psychology and neuroscience. I mean, we could reduce these experiences to events in the brain, but we'd lose pretty much all of their meaning and significance. These are experiences that mean things to people. They can mean things in a negative way. They can be very frightening, very troublesome, very distressing experiences, but they can also be very positive. They exist across cultures and across historical periods, and they've been interpreted differently in different periods of history as well. From my point of view, one of the most interesting historical case studies has been that of the early 15th century mystic Margery Kempe, who wrote an extraordinary book. It's known as the Book of Margery Kempe, and she should be better known, to be honest, because she wrote the first book in the English language that can be considered an autobiography. She was the first person to write about her own life in English, which makes her a literary giant just for that reason. She was an extraordinary character. She was a mother of 14. She'd failed as a businesswoman twice. Sometime around the birth of her first child, she started to have voices and visions, which she interpreted in a spiritual and a religious framework. And then later in life, she had further revelations which led her to dedicate herself to telling the world about her experiences. So she would go and knock on the doors of princes and bishops. She'd dress all in white. She'd command attention, ask people to listen to her stories of her experiences. It was a very risky thing to do. And we have rich, vivid accounts of what her experiences were like. So in her earliest experience, she wakes up from asleep and she sees this figure sitting at the end of her bed. And the figure is dressed in a purple cloak, and he says to her, "Daughter, why have you forsaken me when I never forsook you?" It's Jesus Christ. She sees Christ sitting at the end of her bed. But her experiences, they can be very clearly auditory. She talks about hearing the voice of God as clearly as if there'd been another person in the room with her. But she also writes about experiences that don't fit so neatly into the idea of hearing voices as this kind of intoning voice, this kind of commanding voice. So for example, she talks about hearing this sort of rustling sound, which she takes to be the sound of the Holy Spirit, comparing it to a pair of bellows, the things that you would pump a fire up with. Another time she hears the Holy Spirit as the voice of a robin redbreast. So it becomes the voice of a bird, or in another occasion, the voice of a dove. So she has this range of experiences, these diverse, rich, complex experiences. They go with visual sensations, they go with bodily sensations. Experiences like Margery's are meaningful. They're meaningful in all sorts of different ways, and those meanings are constructed in different ways by different people at different times. By looking into the past, we can see some of those processes of meaning-making in action. We can see them in the context, the social and the religious and the cultural contexts in which they emerge. The idea that Margery's experiences were a kind of internal dialogue is really liberating. It's helped me to rethink my own sort of cognitive psychology model of how these things work. But it gives us a different way of thinking about prayer as well, and of spiritual meditation. The idea that Margery is having a conversation with a beloved figure that she's sort of internalised and that she carries around with her. Sometimes that conversation is a very condensed inner dialogue where she's very close to the figure, that she's sort of, it's a sense of being with her God, a kind of different way of thinking about spiritual meditation. At other times, the dialogue is more what I would call expanded. So it has more of the to and fro conversational quality of a dialogue. And that's the point at which Margery hears God speaking to her as an external voice. So this has been really influential for me, for my thinking. And it helps us to think differently about what prayer is and how it works and the different ways in which somebody can seek comfort and solace from being with a spiritual entity.